You know, if you talk to anybody during the SNES era and even beyond, there really is no mistaking of just how good Donkey Kong Country was. And as a person who grew up playing Donkey Kong Country, and all these years later, I've actually grown very fascinated in terms of finding out how everything came to be. And after doing some research, I was actually very not only impressed, but there was a whole bunch of things that I didn't know in just about what went into not only developing Donkey Kong, but all the stuff that happened in between. And the simple version is that, simply put, there was a lot of hard work put into releasing this game at the time when it was released. And I felt that the story itself was very good and very unique. And after reading it, I wanted to share it with you. I wanted to kind of read it along to you, so to speak, right? Because Donkey Kong Country is one of those games that is one of the best games that has ever been developed, period. It is one of those staples that will ripple through time for years to come, even though it's been, I believe, if my math is correct, nearly 30 years since this game has been released. It had such an impact that, especially that for people that are around my age range, give or take 5 to 10 years, have also been impacted by this game. And in terms of the leaps and bounds that this game actually made on the industry at the time that it made it, it was truly a really big and marvelous achievement. So let's get right into it. So when it comes to the background of Donkey Kong Country, in 1985 there was a British game developer, named two of them actually, named Tim and Chris Stamper, and they established Rare. And basically, the brothers had previously founded the British computer game studio Ultimate Play the Game, and they founded Rare to focus on the Japanese console market. So after Nintendo actually rejected their efforts to form a partnership in 1983, Chris basically studied the NES hardware for like 6 months straight, and then he basically was able to demonstrate that it was possible to reverse engineer the NES, and actually showed several tech demos to Nintendo executive Minoru Arakawa, who was actually impressed by that. And he ended up granting Rare a Nintendo developer license. So Rare developed more than 60 Nintendo games, including the Battletoads series and ports of games such as Marble Madness. And that's for the regular Nintendo, okay? So when Nintendo released the next console, which was the Super Nintendo, or the SNES, today it's also called the SNES, in 1991, Rare decided to limit their output. So in 1992, Rare invested their their NES profit in Silicon Graphics Incorporated, or SGI. So they had challenge workstations in Elias rendering software to render 3D models. And it was a significant risk, actually. So each workstation actually costed £80,000. And the move that Rare made was the most technologically advanced UK developer that situated them high in the international market at the time. So as far as the conception of the game goes, it goes as follows. So they had purchased the workstation to produce games for the Nintendo 64, actually, which was in development at the time. And Rare discovered that it was actually possible to use them with the 16-bit SNES. So Rare tested the SGI technology with Battletoads Arcade, which came out in 1994, and began developing a boxing game called Brute Force using the Power Animator at the time. So Nintendo was in a console war with Sega at the time, whose Mega Drive, also known as the Sega Genesis, competed with the SNES. And Nintendo had wanted a game to compete with Sega's Aladdin. And anybody who played Sega back in the day with Aladdin in 1993 can attest to this, myself being one of these people. And it featured graphics by Disney animators, actually, at the time. So when Nintendo of America chairman Howard Lincoln learned of Rare's SGI experiments during a trip to Europe at the time. So after impressing Nintendo with a demonstration of Brute Force, Tim was actually inspired by Mortal Kombat's use of digitized footage in place of hand-drawn art. Suggesting developing a platform game that used pre-rendered graphics, Nintendo actually allowed the Stampers permission to use the Donkey Kong intellectual property at the time. So the franchise had been largely like dormant since its unsuccessful Donkey Kong 3 in 1983. So let's not confuse that with Donkey Kong Country 3. So So we're talking Donkey Kong 3, like way back when in 1983. So Nintendo figured that licensing it posted minimal risk because it's been quite a long time. So some sources actually indicate that the Stampers obtained the license after Nintendo offered them their catalog of characters, and they ended up choosing Donkey Kong. And at the same time, it's been conversely said that the lead designer, Greg Mayles, recalled that it was Nintendo that requested a Donkey Kong Country game or a Donkey Kong game. So according to Mayles, Nintendo codenamed the project Country based on Rare's location of Twycross, leading the title to Donkey Kong Country. So Rare assembled a team of 12 people, which was the largest in history at that time, and development ended up beginning. So Nintendo was actually skeptical of Rare's approach to graphics because they were concerned that it would make the game unplayable. So early in development, Mayles and the developers actually presented a demo to Nintendo staff in Japan. One in attendance, the Game Boy creator, whose name is Gunpei Yoki, felt the game looked too 3D, but Mayles said Donkey Kong Country's creator Seiji Miyamoto was supportive and gave the Rare his approval. So Donkey Kong Country was the first Donkey Kong game that was neither directed nor produced by Miyamoto, which was a big deal, who was working on Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island in 1995 at the time. So Miyamoto was still involved with the project, and Rare said that he provided crucial input. So Nintendo is usually very highly protective of their intellectual properties, but was relatively uninvolved with Donkey Kong Country, leaving most of the work to Rare. Programmer Brendan Gunn noted that the Stampers worked to shield the team from outside influence. Rare spent 18 months developing Donkey Kong Country from an initial concept to a finished game, and according to project manager Dan Osen, 20 people worked on it in total. It costed an estimated $1 million to produce, and Rare said that it had the most man-hours ever invested in a video game at the time, 22 years. The team worked 12 to 16 hours every day of the week. Gunn said that the team was under significant pressure from the Stampers and to finish the game in time for Thanksgiving due to Nintendo's competition with Sega. So now we're going on to the design aspect, which was very interesting. So here we go. Rare drew inspiration from the Super Mario series. Mayos citing that Super Mario Bros. 3, which came out in 1988, as the primary influence in the level design. Mayles wanted to make a game that was accessible but would flow seamlessly for a skilled player. As such, objects were placed so well timed that players could continually move through the level. Now, he noted that although the concept of speedrunning did not exist at the time, the way the game was designed definitely supported it. The team designed levels using post-it notes, so they would conceive a set piece, such as swinging ropes, for instance, created to create a variation that every variation that they could think of, drew them on post-it notes, and placed them together. Rare featured barrels as primary game mechanic to pay homage to the original arcade game, and included hidden collectibles and coins and balloons to add depth. Diddy Kong originated from Rare's search of a game mechanic akin to Super Mario Bros. Power-up system that he could serve as the player's health. Mayles said that we thought a second character would perform this function, look visually impressive, and give the player a feeling that they were not alone. Donkey Kong Country did not have much scrapped content, actually. Gunn said he only regretted that Donkey Kong walks across dotted lines instead of paths in the world map, which he could not be implemented due to time constraints. One scrapped idea, a collectible that would evade the player by running or hiding, served as the basis of the Jinjos in Rare's subsequent game Banjo-Kazooie, which came out in 1998. Reviewing Donkey Kong Country to release, Nintendo directed Rare to reduce the difficulty to appeal to a broad audience, reasoning that the secrets would provide sufficient challenge for hardcore gamers. At this point, Miyamoto made some last-minute suggestions, such as Donkey Kong's terrain slap that were incorporated. Nintendo's Kazuki Tanabe flew to Twycross to localize the game with Rare. Kevin Bayliss was in charge of redesigning Donkey Kong. He wanted a character that looked believable and could perform animations like pounding his chest. His initial design was blocky and muscular to make Donkey Kong easy to animate, but it became more cartoonish when Nintendo faxed reference material. Some of Bayliss's designs were in the style of the Battletoads work, and the final design's eyes came from those of the Battletoads. So Miyamoto provided some suggestions, including red tie, but left the design specifics to Bayless. Because Donkey Kong did not have much of an established universe, Rare was free to expand it with new characters. Mayles conceived Diddy as a redesign of Donkey Kong Jr. Unlike the original Donkey Kong Jr., Rare did not want Diddy to share his build with Donkey Kong, so they based him on a spider monkey and made him agile to give him distinct moves. Nintendo considered the redesign too great of a departure and asked it to be reworked or presented as a new character. Miles felt that the redesign suited the updated Donkey Kong universe, so he chose to make it a new character. Naming the character was a challenge, and Rare dropped their preferred Dinky Kong due to legal problems. Rare spent hours on the nearby Taikwa Zoo recording gorillas for reference, which they described as a complete waste of time. They found their movements unsuitable for a fast game and their noises too quiet to be captured by a microphone, so they based Donkey Kong's running animation on a horse's gallop and had programmer Mark Battleridge provide Donkey and Diddy's voice clips. Rare positioned Cranky Kong as the original Donkey Kong character from the arcade games, but avoided mentioning this in the game and marketing materials out of fear that Nintendo would disapprove of the idea, though it was mentioned in the instruction manual. The antagonists are the Kremlings, which recycled from a cancelled Rare game. Rare's initial story was extensive and spanned 15 pages, but Nintendo had it condensed and fit into an instruction manual. Donkey Kong Country was one of the first games for a mainstream home video console to use pre-rendered 3D graphics, a technique used in the earlier 1993 Finnish game Stardust and the Amiga. Rare developed a compression technique that allowed the team to incorporate more detail and animation for each sprite for a given memory footprint, which better preserved the pre-rendered graphics. Nintendo and Rare called the technique Advanced Computer Modeling, or ACM. Rare briefly feared competition from DMA Designs' Uniracers in 1994, which also featured pre-rendered graphics, but the staff was also relieved upon learning that the major player character was Uniracer's only element that was pre-rendered. The artist began modeling the characters in NURBS, using Power Animator and adding textures. They then created the animations and rendered them frame by frame before compressing them into the game. The ACM process was handled by a designated computer that had a proprietary utility similar to Deluxe Paint. Adapting to the cutting-edge SGI workstations was quite difficult. Greg Mayall's brother Steve said that it had a steep learning curve. The game was Rare's first to require multiple programmers, and they worked with little guidance. To help, Nintendo provided Rare with research material regarding apes, barrels, and caves. The pre-rendered graphics allowed for variety of detail uncommon at the time, and Tim Stamper constantly pushed the team to go further and incorporate weather and lighting effects. The ACM process pushed the SNES hardware to its limits. Betteridge said that Rare wanted to do everything they could with the hardware, similar to what they had done with the NES game Battletoads, which came out in 1991. A single SGI screen took up more memory than an entire SNES cartridge, and Greg Mayles described transferring the backgrounds into the game by splitting them into tiles as the bane of the project. Models took hours to render, so the team would leave the computers running overnight. Sometimes artists would even shut down other artists' computers in the middle of the process so they could render their own models. The SGI machines required a massive air conditioning unit to prevent overheating, and while the team worked in the summer heat without relief, programmer Chris Sutherland was responsible for implementing the graphics and found reducing the characters' frames of animation challenging. With the music of Donkey Kong Country, David Wise composed most of the soundtrack. Wise initially worked as a freelancer and assumed his music would be replaced by a Japanese composer because of the importance of Donkey Kong to Nintendo. Rare asked Wise to record 3 jungle demo tunes that were merged to become the DK Island Swing, the first levels track. Wise was subsequently offered the job to produce the final score. Before composing, Wise was shown the graphics and was given an opportunity to play the level that they would appear in, which gave him a sense of the music he would compose. Then he chose samples and optimized the music to work on the SNES SPC 700 sound chip. Wise worked separately from the team in a former cattle shed, visited occasionally by Tim Stamper. Donkey Kong Country features atmospheric music that mixes natural environmental sounds with prominent melodic and percussive accomplishments. Its soundtrack attempts to evoke the environments and includes music from levels set in Africa-inspired jungles, caverns, oceanic reefs, frozen landscapes, and instrumental factories. Wise called Koji Kondo's music for the Super Mario and the Legend of Zelda games, Tim and Jeff Svallin's music for Poki, 1993, Sound of the Kong Wave Station Sinister. Wise wanted to compose a style of the 1940s jazz, but restricted by the SPC 700's limitations. He used a lot of small samples and made the soundtrack very synthesized to work around them. Since Donkey Kong Country featured advanced pre-rendered graphics, Wise wanted to push the limits in terms of audio to create equally impressive music to make the most of the small space he was working with. Aquatic Ambience, the music that plays in the underwater levels, took 5 weeks to compose. Wise considers the track his favorite and the game's biggest technological accomplishment in terms of the audio. Hey Rule's theme was influenced by the work of Iron Maiden. For the title screen theme, Wise remixed the Nintendo's original Donkey Kong theme to demonstrate how Donkey Kong had evolved since his debut. Wise said his primary focus was to make the most of the SPC 700, and he input the music by hand to save memory. He noted the process was easier than composing for the NES due to the larger number of sound channels. Evelyn Novavelkic contributed to the 7 tracks, including the world map theme as her first SNES project. Novakovic was inexperienced with the SNES hardware, and Wise helped her teach her as they worked together. She attempted to provide the levels a sense of purpose and drew inspiration from the composers like Alan Silvestri and Klaus Dellinger. Donkey Kong's theme was originally written by Robin Beanland. According to Beanland, the track was intended for an internal progress video about another Rare game, Killer Instinct, which came out in 1994, before Nintendo decided to use it on Donkey Kong Country promotional trailer instead. Beanland said that Tim Stamper liked it and wanted to include it in the game, so Wise adopted it. When it comes to the marketing, Lincoln unveiled Donkey Kong Country at the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, which took place from the 23rd to the 25th of June in 1994. The unveiling was one of the finales of Nintendo's conference and did not reveal that Donkey Kong Country was an SNES game until the very end of the presentation, fooling the audience into believing that it was for the upcoming Nintendo 64. Greg Miles recalled the audience was stunned in silence before bursting into applause. As one of the flagship games for the Nintendo's Play It Loud promotion, Donkey Kong Country was backed by an exceptionally large marketing campaign, marketing blitzkrieg, as Hardware Gaming 101 put it. According to the Los Angeles Times, Nintendo spent $16 million on marketing Donkey Kong Country in America alone. At the time, major games typically had an average marketing budget of $5 million. Marketing materials emphasized the revolutionary graphics, often noting that Rare's SGI workstations had been used to create the Jurassic Park 1993 film's dinosaurs, and positioned Donkey Kong Country as a direct competitor to Sega's Mega CD and 32X platforms to remind players that it was not for next-generation hardware. Nintendo sent a promotional VHS tape, Donkey Kong Country Exposed, to subscribers of the magazine Nintendo Power. Exposed, hosted by comedian Josh Wolf, provides the behind-the-scenes glimpse of the Treehouse, the Nintendo of America division where games are tested. Nintendo World Report wrote that Exposed was probably the first time most people outside of Nintendo learned about the Treehouse, and the promotion allowed players to see the game for themselves at home rather than having to learn it secondhand from a magazine. Exposed also features gameplay tips and interviews with localizers, playtesters, and Tim Stamper himself. In October of 1994, Nintendo of America held an online promotional campaign through the internet service CompuServe. The campaign included downloadable video samples of the game, a trivia contest of which 800 people participated in, and an hour-long online chat conference attended by 80 people in which Lincoln Arcanawa and the Vice President of Marketing, Peter Main, answered questions. Nintendo's CompuServe promotion marked an early instance of a major video game company using the internet to promote its products. Nintendo gave away Donkey Kong t-shirts as a pre-order bonus and partnered with Kellogg's for a promotional campaign in which packaging for Kellogg's breakfast cereals featured Donkey Kong Country character art and was announced a prize giveaway. The campaign ran from November of 1994 to April of 1995. Three-Way Publications published the promotional comic book in the UK in 1995. A soundtrack CD, DK Jams, was released via news media and retailers of November of 1994, with a standalone release in 1995. It was one of the earliest video game soundtrack albums released in the United States. A promotional competition-oriented version of Donkey Kong Country was sold through Blockbuster Video. Its changes include a time limit for the playable levels and a scoring system which had been used in Nintendo's Power Fest in 1994 and Blockbuster World Video Game Championship 2 competitions. It was later distributed in limited quantities through Nintendo Power. The competition version of Donkey Kong Country is the rarest licensed SNES game. Only 2,500 cartridges are known to exist. So in context, by October of 1994, Nintendo was still in fierce competition with Sega and its popular Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. Donkey Kong Country was released a month later after Sonic and Knuckles for the Mega Drive. The Los Angeles Times characterized the coincidencing of releases as a battle. Both featured company mascots, boasted Hollywood-sized marketing budgets, and advertised revolutionary technological advances. Lock-on technology for Sonic and Knuckles, and 3D rendering graphics for Donkey Kong Country, respectively. Donkey Kong Country was highly anticipated. Hardcore Gaming 101 wrote, "It was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. It was on the cover of every magazine. It was on gigantic, imposing displays and marquees at Walmart and Babbage's. For kids of the era, November 20th seemed like an eve of a revolution. The exposed VHS tape contributed significantly to the hype. Donkey Kong Country was expected to gross at least $140 million in the US if it matched its sales projections. Nintendo anticipated that it would sell 2 million copies a month, an expectation that Main acknowledged was unprecedented, but it was based off of the off-chart reactions we received from the game players and retailers. US Gamer noticed that Nintendo, at the time of Donkey Kong Country's release, faced difficulty to keep the SNES profitable. The fifth generation of video game consoles was on the horizon, the 32-bit prowess of Sony's PlayStation and the Sega Saturn for exceeding the SNES's capabilities. The Nintendo 64 was not due to release until 1996, so Donkey Kong Country, wrote US Gamer, served as a Nintendo's bluff to make it seem like the SNES could hold its ground against the next generation hardware. So as far as sales go, Donkey Kong Country was released worldwide in November of 1994, 2 weeks ahead of schedule around the Black Friday shopping season. It was released in the UK on November 18th, in North America on the 21st of November, in Europe in the 24th of November, and in Japan on the 26th of November. In Japan, the game was released under the title Super Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong Country set the world records for the fastest selling video game at the time. It sold over 500,000 copies within a week, and sales reached 1 million copies in the US alone in 2 weeks. In its second week on sale in the US, the game grossed over $15 million, outpacing the week's highest grossing film, The Santa Claus, which was $11.5 million. The album, Miracles on Holiday Album, $5.2 million, and in the UK it was the top selling SNES game in November of 1994. Donkey Kong Country sold 6 million copies worldwide in its first holiday season, grossing $400 million worldwide sales revenue. Cumulative sales reached 9.3 million copies based on Avalanche available sales figures. It's the third best-selling SNES game and the best-selling Donkey Kong game. As far as reception of the game goes, Donkey Kong Country received critical acclaim and was launched as the paradigm shift that set new standards for video games. Die Hard Games fan in total said that it changed expectations for the 16-bit and platform game. And Entertainment Weekly wrote it's most 16-bit games what most 16-bit games are to the Atari forebears. Once you've played it, everything else before it seems like a peewee. Electronic Gaming Monthly, EGM, called Donkey Kong Country one of the few games that is actually as good as the hype. In total, declared it the best game of 1994. Game fans said that Donkey Kong Country set a new quality standard that many developers would attempt to imitate. The visuals were considered the best aspect. Review is considered a major technological advancement. The detail unprecedented for a 16-bit game. EGM said that the graphical quality prompted questions about the purpose of 32 and 64-bit hardware. Total said the character animations surpassed those of a Disney film and applauded the parallax scrolling. Several critics said that the graphics were the best on available hardware. with Entertainment Weekly writing that they were comparable to matte paintings. The soundtrack and audio were also lauded. Total said that the music built atmosphere. Top Secret wrote that the captivating soundtrack asserted itself as a masterpiece in its own right. And EGM and Entertainment Weekly said that the audio quality was unprecedented for the SNES and on par with CDs. Reviewers praised the gameplay for its variety and depth. Entertainment Weekly appreciated that it did not build upon the original arcade's design. Total described Donkey Kong Country as addictive, accessible, and exciting with humor, imagination, puzzles, and secrets that proved that there was still potential in the platform game genre. EGM and GameFan wrote that the game was lengthy and offered plenty of technique, and GamePro commented the replay value that searching for bonus stages provided. EGM and GamePro found searching for bonus stages was challenging, though GamePro said it was easy to breeze through the game without them and criticized the boss fights as simplistic. Critics frequently compared Donkey Kong Country to the Super Mario series, particularly Super Mario World, which came out in 1990. Some considered Donkey Kong Country an improvement upon the Mario formula. GameFan said that it would be a worthy successor to Super Mario World, even without the graphics, and Total wrote that it took Mario's best elements, increased the speed, and presented them even better. Next Generation felt that the gameplay, though good, did not meet the standards of previous SNES games such as Mario and The Legend of Zelda series and prevented it from being a typical Nintendo blockbuster. CVG wrote that Donkey Kong Country was the only SNES game that matched Super Mario World, but that it would be a conventional platformer without its graphics. It warned that experienced players may find the game designed for a broad audience unoriginal. As far as accolades go, Donkey Kong Country received many of the Game of the Year awards. For EGM's Best and Worst of 1994, it won Game of the Year, Best SNES Game, and Best Animation. Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong won Best Game Duo. It also received Video Games the Ultimate Gaming Magazine's award for Game of the Year, but SNES Game, Best NES Game, Best Action Game, and Best Graphics. Donkey Kong Country was the only video game included in Time's Best Products of 1994's list, coming in second behind Chrysler Neon, and it became the first game to win the Favorite Video Game Kids' Choice Award in 1995 Kids' Choice Awards. After its release, in April of 1995, following Donkey Kong Country's success, Nintendo purchased a 25% minority stake in Rare, which increased to 49% over time. Rare was the first non-Japanese studio to enter such a relationship with Nintendo, making them a second-party developer. Nintendo published Rare's subsequent games and allowed them to expand its staff from 84 to over 250 and move out of the farmhouse to an advanced development site elsewhere in Tycross. Rare was one of the first developers to receive N64 software development kits and decided to start spending more time developing fewer games. Nintendo and Rare's partnership produced acclaimed Nintendo 64 games such as GoldenEye 007, which came out in 1997, Banjo-Kazooie, which came out in 1998, Perfect Dark, which came out in 2000, and Conker's Bad Fur Day, which came out in 2001. A proposed Game Boy and Donkey Kong Country was repurposed as a separate game, Donkey Kong Land, 1995, after the programmer Paul Mokachek convinced Rare that it would be a better use of resources and expand the potential audience. Rare began developing concepts for a Donkey Kong Country sequel during production, and Nintendo greenlit the project immediately after the success. Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest, released in 1995, features Diddy rescuing a kidnapped Donkey Kong from K. Rool and introduces Diddy's girlfriend, Dixie Kong. Diddy's Conquest was designed to be less linear and more challenging, with a theme reflecting Greg Miles' fascination with pirates. Like its predecessor, Diddy Kong's Quest was a major critical and commercial success. Other teams at Rare used Donkey Kong Country's technology in the fighting game Killer Instinct and Donkey Kong Land, Donkey Kong Land 2, which came out in 1996, and Donkey Kong Land 3, which came out in 1997, which attempted to replicate Donkey Kong Country's visuals and gameplay on the handheld Game Boy. Following Diddy's Conquest, the Donkey Kong Country team split in two. One half began working on the Project Dream, a role-playing game that used the Donkey Kong Country technology, and the other on Donkey Kong Country 3, Diddy's Kong's Double Trouble. In 1996, Rare followed Dixie's Double Trouble with Donkey Kong 64, came out in 1999. The first Donkey Kong game to feature 3D gameplay. In 2002, Rare was acquired by Nintendo's competitor Microsoft, and the Donkey Kong rights reverted to Nintendo. Now, as far as re-release is concerned, in 2000 Rare developed a port of Donkey Kong Country for Nintendo's Game Boy Color handheld console, but it was released in North America on November of 2000, and in Europe in the 17th of November, and Japan in the 21st of January 2001. The port was developed alongside the Game Boy version of Perfect Dark, and many assets, including graphics and audio, were reused from the Donkey Kong Land games. Aside from graphical and sound-related downgrades due to the Game Boy Color's weaker 8-bit hardware, the port is mostly identical to the original release. One level is redesigned and another was added. It also adds bonus modes, including 2 mini-games that supplemented the main quest and support multiplayer due to the Game Link cable, as well as Game Boy printer support. The Game Boy Color version was a runner-up for GameSpot's annual Best Game Boy Color Game and the Best Platform Game Award. Despite its acquisition by Microsoft, Rare continued to produce games for Nintendo Game Boy Advance. Since Microsoft did not have a competing handheld, it ported Donkey Kong Country as part of Nintendo's line of SNES releases for the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance version was re-released in Europe in June 6 of 2003, in North America on the 9th of June, and in Japan in the 12th of December. It adds a new animated introductory cutscene, redesigned user interfaces, and world maps. The ability to save progress anywhere, and mini-games in a mini-time trial mode. It features downgraded graphics and sound, the former due to Game Boy Advance's lack of backlit screen. The Game Boy Advance version sold 960,000 copies and earned $26 million in the US by August of 2006. Between January 2000 and August of 2006, it was the 19th highest best-selling game for a Nintendo handheld console in the United States. The SNES version of Donkey Kong Country has been digitally re-released later for Nintendo consoles via Nintendo's Virtual Console server. It was released for the Wii Virtual Console in Japan and in Europe in December of 2006, and in North America in February 2007. In September of 2012, the game was delisted from the Virtual Console for unknown reasons, though Kotaku's Jason Schreier suggested that it may be related to licensing problems with Rare. Donkey Kong Country returned to the Wii U's Virtual Console in February 2015, and was added to the new Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console in March of 2016. It was included in the Super SNES Classic Edition, a dedicated console Nintendo released in September 2017, and was released on the Nintendo Switch for Nintendo Switch Online subscribers in July of 2020. So when it comes to the legacy of Donkey Kong Country, its visual appeal helped the SNES remain popular in a period of uncertainty for cartridge-based games. Consumers were unfamiliar with 3D graphics at the time. According to official Nintendo magazine, by bringing the next generation graphics to the SNES just 12 days before the PlayStation Japanese launch, Donkey Kong Country persuaded consumers that an immediate upgrade was necessary. IGN wrote that the game saved the SNES and revitalized sales by bringing back lapsed fans. Donkey Kong Country also helped Nintendo pull ahead of Sega to win the console wars of the 1990s. Whereas Nintendo continued to re-release AAA games such as Donkey Kong Country, Sega had alienated audiences with add-ons such as the Mega CD and the 32X, and its subsequent console, the Saturn, failed. Donkey Kong Country series re-established Donkey Kong as one of Nintendo's most popular and profitable franchises. Donkey Kong Country heralded Donkey Kong's transition from villain to hero. Rare's redesign became its standard appearance, and its gameplay format was followed by sequels. The game inspired an animated series that ran for 40 episodes from 1997 to 2000, and Diddy Kong started in a Nintendo 64 racing game spin-off, Diddy Kong Racing, which came out in 1997. Following Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, the Country series went on a hiatus until Donkey Kong Country Returns, developed by Retro Studios, were released in the Wii on the Donkey Kong Country 16th anniversary in 2010. A sequel, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, was released for the Wii U in 2014. Wise, who left Rare in 2009, returned to compose Tropical Freeze's score. As far as retrospective assessments, reviewing the Virtual Console's release, Nintendo Life felt that the visuals were still among the SNES's best, and JukesVideo.com said that they had offered a new depth of realism. IGN and All Games said that the visuals remained impressive for the SNES, though IGN thought that they were no longer significant of a draw, while GameSpot thought that the graphics rivaled 32-bit consoles. Conversely, US gamers said that although technologically impressive, they did not age well, with cringe-inducing paper-thin backgrounds, Hard, Hardcore Gaming 101 agreed, writing that the visuals looked plastic-like and did not hold up well once the novelty of re-rendering had worn off, and were clearly experimental even though their detail were admirable. Critics praised the Game Boy Color version for attempting to preserve the visuals in spite of hardware limitations, but criticized the Game Boy Advance versions for downgrades, which IGN considered detrimental to the experience. Donkey Kong Country became divisive in the years following its release. Eurogamer wrote that it became popular to dislike in the early 2000s, and it was also described as one of the most overrated video games. For example, Vice wrote that it did not deserve to be considered a classic alongside GameSpy, called its gameplay unremarkable and lacking depth. According to IGN, critics accused Donkey Kong Country of sacrificing gameplay for the sake of a short-run attention grab and quick impulse sales, which US Gamer attributed to the inflammatory of its visuals were relatively mundanity to the actual game design. US Gamer wrote that the game was often criticized as an example of a style of oversubstance, with gameplay was arguably inferior to the SNES console launch games such as Super Mario World and Super Castlevania IV. GameSpy complained that Donkey Kong Country overshadowed games such as Yoshi's Island, which is considered superior. Nonetheless, Donkey Kong Country is considered one of the greatest video games of all time. US Gamer wrote that the criticism was unfair because it exudes craftsmanship. Rare went on great pains to create a consistent, seamless world that managed to convey Trumpy Ole immersion, something few developers could replicate. Though retrospective reviewers criticized the boss fights, they praised the rhythm, variety, and replay value. Polygon said that although some aspects had not aged well, Donkey Kong Country remained among the best Donkey Kong Country games and deserved praise for resurrecting the franchise. Its soundtrack is considered one of the best in games, praised for its atmosphere and diversity. Hardcore Gaming 101 said it was one element that is unquestionably aged well and contains some of the 16-bit era's most memorable music. In the years following its release, rumors spread that Miyamoto disliked Donkey Kong Country and found it amateurish, and had created the hand-drawn art style of Yoshi's Island in retaliation for its pre-rendered visuals. The author Stephen L. Kent quoted Miyamoto as saying that Donkey Kong Country proves gamers will put up with mediocre gameplay if the art is good, in a 1995 Electronics Games interview. Kent said that Nintendo's marketing department had rejected Yoshi's Island as it lacked Donkey Kong Country's pre-rendered graphics, and that this had possibly motivated Miyamoto's remark. Miyamoto denied this in 2010, noting he was very involved in Donkey Kong Country and had been in regular correspondence with Stamper until the end of the development. In 2014, US Gamer described Kent's claims as seemingly hypocritical. When it comes to influence, Donkey Kong Country exerted revolutionary influence, according to GameSpot. Kotaku said that its unprecedented graphics represented the future of games, and Nintendo World Report wrote that it set standards for how platform games would look and play. Sega commissioned Blue Sky Software to develop Mega Drive game Vector Man, which came out in 1995, in response to Donkey Kong Country's popularity. Many developers imitated the visuals. IGN identified the Saturn games Clockwork Knight, which came out in 1994, and Bug in 1995 as examples. US Gamer wrote that the few games achieved the same quality that the 2.5D games such as Crystal Dynamics' Pandemonium, which came out in 1996, it exposed the illusion that which Donkey Kong Country was built. Kotaku said Donkey Kong Country was an event that could not be replicated in modern times due to the game industry's growth. Naughty Dog's founders Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin cited Donkey Kong Country as a primary influence in their breakout game Crash Bandicoot, which came out in 1996. Crash's first functional levels drew upon techniques employed by Donkey Kong Country, such as steam vents, drop platforms, bouncy pads, heated pipes, and enemies that move back and forth. The pre-rendered visuals inspired other games, including Kirby Starland, which came out in 1996, and Sonic 3D Frickles Island, which came out in 1996, and critics have identified Donkey Kong Country references and influences in games such as the Mega CD version of Earthworm Jim, which came out in 1995, Sonic Blast, which came out in 1996, Rayman Origins, which came out in 2011, Mecha-Zoo, which came out in 2016, and K's in the Wild Mess, which came out in 2021. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation credited Donkey Kong Country for maintaining the popularity of 2D games and ensuring the development of the new entries of Mario, Kirby, and the Yoshi series. The soundtrack was also influential, and Wise developed a cult following for his work. Rearrangements for the music appear in Donkey Kong Country 64, Donkey Kong Country Returns, and Donkey Kong Country Tropical Breeze, and in a crossover game such as Nintendo's Super Smash Bros. Fighting games. Its tracks are often remixed, Wise contributing to an overclocked remix album in 2004. The AV Club wrote that the aquatic ambience alone spawned a minor cult dedicated to remixes. The rapper Donald Glover sampled aquatic ambience in his 2012 song Eat Your Vegetables. Wise expressed approval. In 2019, the composer Sam Miller reconstructed the soundtrack after locating Wise's original samples. Donkey Kong Country established Rare as one of the leading video game developers and set the standards for its work. It originated conversations characteristic of Rare's later output, including an emphasis on collecting items, visual appeal, and tech demo-like design. Nintendo and Rare's partnership continued until Star Fox Adventures in 2002 for the GameCube, after which Rare was acquired by Microsoft. In 2019, game Yokuda lay gameplay similarities to Donkey Kong Country, though Playtonic's head Gavin Price declined to label it a spiritual successor. Nintendo Life also identified similarities between Donkey Kong Country and Croco Banjo, Tap of the Beat, in 2017, a platform game developed by the Stampers mobile game studio, Fortune Fish. So when you go back and look at it, Donkey Kong Country really did play it had such a very high impact on gaming in general and the games that would be developed after. So if you were around my era, which is, I was about, in 1994, I was 10 years old when I first played this game, and when I first saw it, you just couldn't get away from it. The game just absolutely looked incredible. It played incredible. The color palette was amazing. The music was memorable. Everything about Donkey Kong Country was incredible for the time. And as far as criticisms go, every single game out there has criticisms. There's just absolutely no doubt about it. There's no avoiding it. But with that being said, most of the criticisms are actually very positive. There's hardly any negative criticisms of the game when you look at it overall as a whole. If you grew up during the SNES times, there was actually quite a small chance that you did not have Donkey Kong Country. And the word spread like wildfire. The way I discovered Donkey Kong Country was through a neighbor. He came to my house and he said, check this game out. We put the game in. I found it so good in every single aspect that I just had to have it. I put my best puppy dog face on and begged my mother that we get it, and we got it that night. We went to, Walmart or something, and I recognized the cover art and I got it right away, and I just couldn't be happier. I was up for God knows how long playing that game, and it would just go on for God knows how long, because the game even back then was a challenge. But when you look at the graphics, which was a huge deal, like for every gamer back in the day, graphics were a huge deal. They're still a big deal today, but back then, in terms of what they accomplished, to make something look like almost like the quality of a 32-bit title on a 16-bit system, and the technique that they used, it was a very, very, very unique game. And I praise the developers for their hard work, and I thank every single one of them for developing it, because when you look at the music, the art, the sound, everything, Donkey Kong Country is absolutely a marvelous achievement. And it's responsible for many, it's inspired so many games that were made afterwards. So basically, Donkey Kong Country is more than a game. It was more than a game. There are other games that have achieved that level of legendary status, and Donkey Kong Country was one of those games that achieved that legendary status because of what it was able to accomplish. So at the end of the day, Donkey Kong Country was absolutely incredible. And if you were around during that time as a kid, there will never be any experience like it. Everything about the game is absolutely nostalgic. If we were to play it today, we would still enjoy it, and it would bring back many memories. And it makes me very happy, to the point of happy tears actually, that I was around during that time as a 10-year-old kid, and the fact that I got to experience it, because I wouldn't take that back. Because ultimately, when it comes to everything in life, whether it's video games, whether it's relationships with other people, whatever you want to call it, it's the experiences that make the difference and the relationships that we build with those experiences. And when it came to this game of Donkey Kong Country, this game was your best friend if you had an SNES. And most kids had this game. And I'm glad that my neighbor friend brought it over that night, because if he didn't, I wouldn't have had any idea about Donkey Kong Country. It was unlikely that I would have any idea about it, because back in the day I was a Mortal Kombat addict. I would play Mortal Kombat and I'd play other games and stuff like that, but there was so much that I didn't know about until I was introduced to them by my friends, and Donkey Kong Country was one of those games. So my friend of the 90s, his name is Isaiah, by the way. I haven't seen him since, but to Isaiah, thank you very much. And I wouldn't have had the experiences I had if you didn't come over that day to show me what a damn great game this was. And Donkey Kong Country will forever be a legendary game, and I think anybody who was around in my time will approve. So let me know down in the comment section what you guys think of the game, what impact it had on you, how you played it, and how you heard about it, and how everything just came to be. Let me know down in the comment section. And what did you think about all this development stuff that I just read to you? I mean, pretty damn fascinating if you ask me. So let me know. And I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.